Welcome back. We're talking about race in America. Joining us here in Washington is the radio talk show host and activist Joe Madison. With us from San Francisco is John Powell. He's a professor of law and African American and ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. And also here in Washington is the leading defense attorney and former prosecutor, Abby Lowell. Gentlemen, thanks again for being with us. Joe, you have the floor.
Well, no, what I was going to say as we talk about the ability of prosecutors to get an indictment, someone on my talk show called in and said, yeah, because you often hear this saying, a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich, and somebody said, yeah, if it's, as long as it's not on white bread. I mean, we have to understand, this has been going on for decades. And that's part of the problem. We look at a snapshot of this. I just did a show earlier where we were talking about chokeholds 40 years ago in California. There are cases, policies opposed to chokeholds. And so what has happened here is this has now become intergenerational. It's become multiracial. People on both aisles, politically speaking, ideology, are all outraged. And what I don't understand is why we're not making a move towards independent prosecutors. That's what everyone is suggesting could be part of the solution.
That's right. And Abby Lowell, we've also heard a proposal about civilian review boards.
Well, let's make a couple of points, because we are talking about the legal system and also its impact in a racial way. The problem with the grand jury actually isn't, although these two cases point out, as you just said, there's a little glitch. The problem with it being a prosecutorial tool, that it usually does what prosecutors want it to do, that's not colorblind. That works whether or not the target of the investigation is white, black, or somewhere in between. The problem with the system is that the system in all of its parts has been geared to be disproportionately impactful on people of color. And that's for a variety of reasons. First, it's because we've made jail the punishment of first resort in America. We have more people in jail than virtually anybody, although I think China is in the same category.
Well, I think per capita, the United States has the highest
I think that's right now.
Yeah.
Right.
The second thing is that we have still so many laws that were on the books from, as the professor said, from the Reagan era and other eras where we're showing that we're tough on crime by having mandatory minimum jail sentences, for which President Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder are trying to do something about. But it's a long history. And the third is that so many of our laws still treat drugs and its related activity as if it's a crime. And so if you take those three things, it has more impact in a racial way than it might otherwise have. But the problems with the grand jury, in some ways, cut across all races. As to the solution about special prosecutors and other things, one thing we haven't put into the conversation today is that we do have one check and balance that hasn't yet been heard from, and we should give it a moment. States have all the time not taken cases that it should, going back to the civil rights era of the 1960s. And then the federal government has come in to try to do something. And right now there are federal civil rights investigations going on in the Ferguson matter and in the Garner matter. And I don't think we should give up on the system quite yet until we see where that comes out. Now, it's not going to be a murder investigation or indictment necessarily, but it still is going to be a significant investigation that could lead to civil rights charges. I am skeptical about special prosecutors because special prosecutors are hired with almost the impetus to bring a case. On the other hand, we have to have something other than, as the professor said, having a grand jury in a place that has so many police officers being the judge of whether a police officer should be the one to be charged.
Okay, Professor Powell, I want to share with you something that President Obama has said about these particular two cases. He has been interviewed by the black television network BET, and in that interview he said, we can't equate what is happening right now with the civil rights unrest of 50 years ago. The point the president was trying to make there is that progress has been made. Do you agree with the president?
Well, yes and no. Progress has definitely been made, or progress has been made in some area and lost in other areas. For example, in the 1960s and 70s, we had a much smaller criminal justice system. The disparities between blacks and white arrest and incarceration was 2-to-1, and now it's 8-to-1. So, and it does go back to the 1960s. There's actually very clear evidence that is in part a backlash to the civil rights movement. The United States government and states actually ramped up and retooled criminal justice. So so on that, I think President Obama is actually wrong. It's not that we haven't made progress. The progress is actually uneven, and that's part of the thing that's hard for America. We have this complicated system. Some things are better, some things are worse, and we want it to be one way. It's a complicated system, but it's clear that the way we actually police, the way we do the criminal justice system, a friend and colleague of mine wrote a book called Mass Incarceration, that's the New Jim Crow. It is related. It's not just these two cases. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of cases, disproportionately killings of young black men and young brown men, police often getting off. Whether you look at drugs, a lot of it is related to drugs, but whites use drugs at the same level, if not higher than blacks, and yet whites are not prosecuted nearly as high as blacks. I think it's a mistake to try to look at this as an incident. We're actually looking at something that gives us a view into a system that's not working on so many levels, and that's racially coded on so many levels. So I think it's a chance for us to look at it carefully, which we did in the 60s with the Kerner Commission. And I hope that we'll have a more deliberate, thoughtful look at this, not just the grand jury, but the overall system.
Yeah, Professor is absolutely right, and where I disagree with the president, I usually agree with him the majority of the time. We must remember that when you look at the disturbances of the 60s, Detroit, Newark, Los Angeles, the riots in Los Angeles, most of them began because of abusive police action. That's what happened in Detroit. That's what happened in Los Angeles. That's what happened in Newark. So there's a similarity there.
I mean, look, this is a terrible situation that has occurred in the last few weeks in the United States. But there has been progress made. It would be wrong to say that there's no progress.
Yes.
Second of all, look what is at least good about our system. Right now, we're talking about it. That doesn't happen in other places that have some of the same issues in their law enforcement system as the United States has. Second of all, I talked about the fact that we have a few levels. We have the state and local level and the federal government that can play a watchdog role as the media can be. That doesn't happen in a lot of places either. So while these are really perplexing and troubling cases, and it does reflect that for whatever progress we've made, we haven't made nearly enough. And it's an outrage to look at that videotape and say that doesn't make any sense. There is at least some good news at that. But it's a complicated area. And one of the things that's complicated about it is that you can't just look for the solution at the back end when something goes wrong. With the police, we've now learned that we need new training. I mean, for example, why do we have a training of a police officer that says if you shoot once, you better shoot 8 times until you're sure that the person's dead? Second of all, why do we still have a police force that sees themselves as occupying a neighborhood, as being part of that neighborhood? And why do we have police officers, a force that doesn't reflect the color of the place that they're policing? Those are 3 things that we could deal with tomorrow afternoon.
Professor Powell, you want to say something?
Yes, so I think there is progress, but I think there's also slippage. I think it's too simple to just say there's progress, and I don't think Abby was saying that. But I think, in a sense, to say to the parents of Mr. Brown, or to say to the parents or friends of Mr. Garner that we made progress, actually feels hollow. We're talking about still killings. We're talking about tragedies. And so to now talk about celebrating our progress, again, the progress is mixed. Some things are better, some things are actually worse. And the thing that we often do in this country is we talk about our unique system. Our system is not so unique. In Canada, when you're in prison, you actually have the right to vote. I was in Canada where there had been a shooting and the police chief was on television crying. You simply would not see that in the United States. So there are systems that are actually better than ours. And we're not the worst system, but we're not the best system. And so part of it is political, to sort of basically fly the flag and say what a wonderful system we have. Not perfect, but wonderful. It's not perfect, and it's not the worst system, but we need to take a hard look if we're going to make progress. And so in the 1970s and 80s, we talked about oversight boards. We talked about police living in communities. We've actually walked away from that in almost every community. Yeah. So there's some progress and there's some slippage.
Right. And Joe, talking about the role that black parents play, I mean, let's listen to what the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, who is married to a black woman, let's listen to what he says.
What parents have done for decades who have children of color, especially young men of color, is train them to be very careful when they have a connection with a police officer, when they have an encounter with a police officer. It's different for a white child. That's just the reality in this country. And with Dante, very early on, with my son, we said, look, if a police officer stops you, do everything he tells you to do. Don't move suddenly. Don't reach for your cell phone. because we knew, sadly, there was a greater chance it might be misinterpreted if it was a young man of color.
Paul Mooney tells this joke. He's a comedian here. He says in Los Angeles, he was riding in a car with all white guys, and the police stopped him and asked for his driver's license. He said, hell, I wasn't even driving. The reality is that the mayor is absolutely right. As an African American, I was told by my parents, be very careful. I have an African American son. We grew up in an integrated neighborhood, and I asked his parents' friends, have you ever said to your son that will go out with my son in a weekend, be careful because the police might stop you and A, B, C, D, treat you differently? And every parent said never did they have to have that conversation with their parents. Here in Washington, D.C., we grew up in, my son grew up in Montgomery County, so we're in an integrated neighborhood. And this is the injustice. Let's go back to what our friend Eric Holder, the Attorney General, said when he first took office. We are cowards when it comes to talking about the issue of race. And this is what I think all of us are saying. We've got to have an honest discussion about this issue. And Michelle Alexander, the book the professor was referring to, it takes us back, and people hate to say this, but it takes us back 200, 300, 400 years. This is nothing new.
But that is exactly the point. So look, as American and somebody who's really proud of the country, one of the things I'm least proud of is the fact that our history of dealing with race has been, as Eric and others have said, not what it should be, and we still have the manifestations. Look at the tape, look at et cetera. So while I agree that we've made some progress, I also think that there's been slippage, as the professor says. But it's not going to be any solace to the Garners and the Browns. But this is creating the discussion. This is bringing the issue to the forefront. I don't know what will come from it, but what you just said is exactly right. I have friends that come from better neighborhoods than I grew up in and are as educated as I am, if not more so. And they're African American. And their experience, having walked down the street and being hauled over by a police officer for no other reason, is that the color of their skin is something that they tell me all the time. And it's bizarre, and it's still something that happens, and it needs to be discussed. However, we are discussing it.
Martin Luther King always said, they don't stop you because you're Baptist or because they don't ask you if you're a PhD or no D behind your name. It's simply based on the color of your skin.
We're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV_America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.